The night Daniel picked up the wrong phone, he thought the strangest part of his day would be the cold coffee sitting on the edge of his workbench. The coffee had been sitting there since mid-afternoon. It was bad coffee when it was hot. It was not improving. He had thought about microwaving it twice and decided against it twice, which was probably a metaphor for something, though he was not in the habit of looking for those. He was wrong about the coffee being the strangest part. He was wrong about that by a wide margin. Daniel Marsh was 38 years old, a furniture restorer who operated out of the back half of a converted auto garage on the east side of Millhaven. He stripped lacquer for a living. He matched wood grain. He fixed the things people had decided were not worth fixing anymore and sent them home looking like someone had cared again. He had been doing it for 11 years, through 2 apprenticeships, 1 partnership that dissolved amicably, and 1 marriage that dissolved the same way. His workshop smelled of linseed oil and old cedar, and on the days he was sanding, a fine, pale dust that coated everything within 6 feet and made the whole room look like it had been frosted overnight. He was not a man who talked a great deal about himself. Whether that was a virtue or a symptom depended on who was asking, and he had stopped trying to work out which it was sometime around the end of his marriage to Claire. Claire. They had been together for 7 years and married for 4 of them. The divorce had not been loud. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no discovered secret, no particular Tuesday on which everything changed. There had just been a Tuesday evening about 22 months ago when they sat across from each other over lukewarm pasta and acknowledged without great ceremony that they had become very skilled at not inconveniencing each other. The silence afterward was the loudest thing they had shared in years. He had been seeing Renata for 4 months. She was 41, a graphic designer who worked from a standing desk in her apartment 3 blocks east of his workshop, and she wore her dark hair pinned up with whatever happened to be nearby, a pencil, a chopstick, occasionally the cap of a marker she had forgotten to close. She was specific and warm and slightly ahead of every conversation they had, in the way that some people's brains simply run faster than their surroundings and they have made peace with waiting for the world to catch up. She had told him once that she thought most people talked in order to avoid saying anything, and he had thought about that sentence for about 3 days before he brought it back up. She was already onto a different idea by then. He liked that about her. He was fairly certain he was beginning to like her in a way that was going to require a word for it at some point. It was a Thursday evening in early October. The light outside had gone from amber to charcoal in the space of about an hour. The maple across the alley had started dropping leaves onto the shop roof in small clusters, a soft, irregular percussion that Daniel had stopped noticing and Renata found inexplicably soothing. She had told him that on the 2nd or 3rd evening she had come by, sitting on the tall wooden stool near the secondary workbench with her legs folded under her, eating something from a bag and listening. He had not told her he found it soothing that she found it soothing. He was still working up to things like that. She was there now. Crackers. Sleeve half open on the bench beside her, phone in her hand. He was working a last pass on a walnut sideboard commissioned by a retired teacher named Carol, who wanted the piece to look the way it had looked when her grandmother bought it in 1962, which meant stripping 60 years of well-intentioned refinishing down to something honest. The kettle on the hot plate was beginning to hum. The workshop lamp threw a warm amber circle across the floor. The whole room smelled of walnut and linseed and the faint trace of the coffee he had made 3 hours ago and not finished. Their phones were sitting face down on the corner of the secondary bench, near the cracker sleeve. Both black. Both the same slim model. Both unremarkable in every way. He reached for his because he thought he had heard a buzz from somewhere in the direction of the bench, and the phone he picked up was not his. The screen lit. The notification at the top said Mom. The preview text beneath it read, "Has he asked you yet? Because I heard from Donna that he already has the..." And then the preview cut off. Daniel set the phone down. He looked at it the way you look at something that has moved when you did not expect movement. He looked at Renata, who had not looked up, who was still reading whatever she was reading, whose own phone was still in her hand, which meant the phone on the bench was not hers. The phone on the bench was his. He picked it up again. He opened the message. It was from his mother, Margaret Marsh, 67 years old, retired school librarian, devotee of Sunday phone calls, and a specific brand of mild interference she delivered with complete sincerity and no apparent awareness that it might land as anything other than helpfulness. The full message read, "Has he asked you yet? Because I heard from Donna that he already has the ring sized. Don't let him talk himself out of it, Renata. That boy waits until everything is perfect, and nothing is ever perfect, and he will wait until he's 60. Just say yes before he works up the nerve to ask." He stood holding the phone for a moment that stretched out in a strange and untethered way. His mother had been texting Renata, His mother, who claimed not to understand texting and who still began voicemails by announcing her own name, had apparently developed an independent line of communication with the woman Daniel had been seeing for 4 months and had been using it to coordinate what could only be described as a low-pressure campaign of encouragement. He thought about the ring, which was real, which was in the inside left pocket of his winter coat hanging on the peg by the door, which had been there for 6 weeks while he worked on a sentence. He put the phone back on the bench, face down. He picked up his sanding block. He set it down again. He picked up a rag and wiped the bench he had already wiped twice. The walnut sideboard stood in front of him with the patient indifference of a well-made piece and did not help. "You're doing that thing," Renata said. "What thing?" "The quiet, productive thing, where you get very still and very busy at the same time." She looked up. "Something wrong with the wood?" "Wood's fine." She looked at his face. Then she looked at the bench. Then she looked at his face again. She had a particular kind of attention, Renata. Not intrusive, just accurate. It had taken Daniel about 3 weeks to stop feeling slightly caught out by it and start finding it useful. "That's my phone," she said. "I know." "You picked it up." "They look the same. I thought it was mine." He paused. "I read a message." She unfolded herself from the stool slowly. She came around the secondary bench, picked up her phone, and looked at the screen. Her expression moved through something he could not name exactly. Not surprise, not quite relief, something in between those things. "How much?" she said. "Enough to understand the word yet. And who Donna is, which is, apparently, someone who knows about a ring." Renata set her phone back down. She looked at the walnut sideboard as though it might have an opinion. Then she looked at him. "She started texting me about 6 weeks ago," she said. "Your mother. She opened with a photograph of you at 14. She said, quote, 'Just so you know what you're dealing with.'" "What was the photograph?" "You were at a school event of some kind. You had, and I want to be charitable here, a tremendous amount of hair." He looked at the ceiling. "Of course." "She sends me a message about once a week. Last week she sent me a recipe for the bread she said you used to request when you were sick." Renata paused. "I made it. It was very good." Daniel put the sanding block down for the final time. He was not going to use it again tonight, and he knew it. He crossed his arms and looked at her from across the workbench, and she looked back at him, and the kettle clicked off in the way kettles do when the moment has already arrived and you have simply not caught up with it yet. "She told you about the ring," he said. "She confirmed the ring. I had already suspected the ring." "How?" "Because you went quiet in a particular way about 6 weeks ago that was different from your regular quiet, and because one morning I came in and your winter coat was on the wrong peg and you moved it back when you thought I wasn't looking." She kept her voice level, not smug, careful. "I wasn't going to say anything. It seemed important to you to get there on your own." The lamp hummed. Leaves hit the roof in a small cluster. He looked at her, the pencil still in her hair from this morning, the ink mark on her left wrist that she had not noticed, the way she stood with her weight on one heel when she was waiting for something. He walked to the door, reached into the pocket of his winter coat, and came back with a small gray cardboard box. No ribbon. He had wrapped it in packing tissue once and unwrapped it twice. He held it out to her with both hands. "I had a sentence," he said. "A complete one. Clauses and everything. I have been adjusting it for 6 weeks." "I know," she said softly. "The short version is that I have been certain about you since approximately the second Tuesday you sat on that stool. I am slow at saying things until I know they're right, which is a problem I am aware of, and which has caused me to miss somewhere between 10 and 15 separate moments, when this would have been appropriate." He stopped. "The ring is in the box." She took it from him. She opened it. She held it in the low amber light for a long time, not the way a person evaluates a thing, but the way a person memorizes one. "Yes," she said. "Not a question, not dressed up. Just the word, the way it sounds when someone has been holding it at the ready and finally has a reason to let it go." He put it on her finger. She held her hand up for a moment in the workshop light, then dropped it and looked at him instead. "Your mother," she said, "is going to be completely insufferable about this." She was already insufferable, she knew before I asked. "She's been a step ahead of you the whole time." "She usually is," he said, and then, despite himself, he smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the kind of smile that belongs to a man who has just realized he lost a race he did not know he was in and cannot bring himself to mind. Renata reached up and set her hand briefly on the side of his face. Her thumb was warm from the mug. He did not say anything, neither did she. Outside, a car moved slowly down the alley behind the shop, its headlights sweeping once through the far window, and the workshop held its amber quiet, and the walnut sideboard stood there with its 60 years stripped back to something honest, and everything else was still. He texted his mother that night, a single line. She said yes. The reply came back in under 40 seconds. It was a string of capital letters and several punctuation marks whose combination he had not previously considered possible and would not repeat here, followed by a separate message that read, "I told Donna." Of course she had told Donna. The months that followed were not cinematic. They were better than that. Renata moved into the house he rented 4 blocks from the workshop in February, a narrow craftsman with a muddy yard and a kitchen window that stuck and let in so much morning light that the table beneath it was perpetually warm. She brought her standing desk and her 3 good pots and a framed print of something abstract and green that she had made 4 years ago and never sold because she liked looking at it. He built her a set of shelves for the hallway using reclaimed pine that still smelled faintly of the barn it had come from. She ran her hand along the grain the first time she saw them and said nothing, which was how he knew it was right. There was one evening in late November, about 3 weeks after Renata had moved in, when her former colleague Thomas arrived at their door with what he presented as a simple request to discuss a freelance project, but which turned out, across 45 minutes of kitchen table conversation, to be an extended attempt to establish whether Renata was genuinely settled or potentially available for a different situation he seemed to have been developing in his own thinking for some time. He had good shoes and a practiced ease and the particular confidence of a man who had never been told, clearly and directly, that the room had already made its decision without him. He mentioned twice, in the way of someone who has rehearsed casualness, that he had recently had a very interesting conversation with a client in Vancouver who needed someone with exactly Renata's skill set, and wouldn't it be something, and wasn't it worth at least considering? He called Daniel Buddy once, which was a choice that sat in the room after it was said like a piece of furniture that did not fit the space. He used the phrase, "I just think she deserves more room to make her own choices," in a tone that implied he had appointed himself the authority on what she deserved and the architect of the room she needed. Daniel listened to all of this without expression, in the manner of a man who has spent 11 years working with wood and understands that most things that talk too much are covering for something hollow. The kitchen smelled of the white bean soup on the stove and the faint cedar that followed Daniel home from the shop most evenings, and the overhead light was the warm kind, the kind that makes a room look like something you would want to stay inside. When Thomas had finished making his case, Daniel set down his mug and said simply, "She's standing right there. You could ask her what she wants." Thomas looked at Renata, who had been quiet through most of this with the specific quality of quiet that belongs to a person who has already finished the conversation in her head and is waiting politely for the other party to arrive at the same conclusion. She looked at Thomas with the calm and level attention she applied to things she had already decided about. "I think you should go, Thomas," she said. He went. The door closed. The soup bubbled quietly on the stove. Renata picked up her ladle and stirred it without further comment, and that was the end of Thomas, and they did not discuss him again. They were married the following June in the backyard of Daniel's mother's house, in the manner of people who had decided the event should match the relationship, which was to say warm and specific and not especially interested in performing. Margaret wore a hat she had bought in 1987 and brought out only for what she considered consequential occasions. She cried before the ceremony started, during it, and at a point approximately 2 hours later when she caught Daniel and Renata standing at the edge of the yard with their shoes off in the grass, talking quietly about nothing. She told the story to Donna the next morning. The walnut sideboard, long delivered to Carol by then, received a brief mention in the toast Daniel's old workshop partner gave, in which he noted that Daniel had been working on that piece the night everything changed, which meant either that the sideboard was the most consequential piece of furniture in Millhaven or that Daniel worked at a very specific kind of lucky. Both things were probably true. On a Sunday morning in early October, 1 year to the approximate week from the night of the wrong phone, Daniel was sitting on the back porch of the Craftsman house with coffee and the particular silence of a morning that has not yet decided what it is going to be. Renata came out in her olive sweater with the unraveling cuff and sat across from him with her own mug. The yard was no longer mud. There were 2 raised beds along the fence that she had planted in April, and he had built the borders for in March. The air smelled of turning leaves and the neighbor's lawn and something baking somewhere on the block. She was wearing the ring. She always wore the ring. He thought about the phone on the workbench, about the preview text that cut off at the wrong moment and made him read the rest, about his mother, who had been 3 steps ahead of him, who had texted a woman she had never met because she knew her son, and she knew that sometimes love requires a small logistical assist. He thought about the sentence he had been editing for 6 weeks, all its considered clauses, and how in the end the only thing that had mattered was one word from her, 4 letters, already ready. Renata looked at him over her mug. The contemplative quiet again, she said. Just sitting. You're sitting toward something. He looked at her. I was thinking that I almost didn't read it. The message. I almost put the phone back down. And then I wouldn't have known. And I probably would have kept adjusting the sentence. She set her mug down on the railing and looked at the raised beds for a moment. Or, she said, your mother would have found another way. She had a lot of strategies. She told Donna. She told Donna before she told me. Renata picked her mug back up and looked at him with the specific attention that was still, after all this time, slightly more accurate than he was comfortable with and entirely more valuable than he could say. It was always going to happen, Daniel. He thought about that. He thought about certainty and timing and the ways in which a person can be ready for something without knowing they are ready, carrying the answer in their pocket while they stand there editing the question. He thought it was a very human thing to do, and probably not a problem to be solved, and possibly just the way love works when it belongs to people who are careful with things. Outside, the leaves came down in a small drift from the maple at the back corner. Renata read 2 paragraphs of the paper and set it aside. His coffee went slowly cold, and he drank it anyway. So here is what I want to ask you. If you had picked up the wrong phone and seen a message that told you exactly where things stood before you were ready to say anything, what would you have done? Would you have opened it the rest of the way, or put it back down and kept waiting? And has there ever been someone in your life who could see what you were building toward before you had the words to describe it, and held that space for you until you caught up? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.